those of you that don't know, steelmaking makes up 7 to 12% of global emissions. And so for us, our mission is to enable an infinitely recyclable ferrous supply chain. This is a world where steel is made using scrap metal and electric arc furnaces. Before we dive in, let's just get a look at the two main routes of steelmaking that we see across the world. So you have the first route, which is the blast furnace route, which is where you put iron ore, coke, and limestone into a blast furnace. It gets melted down, and eventually you get steel. And then the second route, which is the electric arc furnace route. And in this route, you put scrap metal into an electric arc furnace, melt it using electricity, and then eventually you get finished steel. And as you can see, because I've skipped ahead a slide, what we have is a vast difference between the CO2 that is emitted from these two routes. So you have around 1.8 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced from a blast furnace, or between 0.4 and 0.8 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced from an electric arc furnace. So it's an enormous difference in terms of the CO2. And so, understandably, you might want to know why we don't just use electric arc furnaces. So what I want to talk about is a little bit about why that process might not be as simple as it sounds. So if I go here, what you can see here is a scrapyard in a steel plant, and each type of scrap is sorted into bays. But the difficulty with this is that you can sort the scrap by type, but knowing what is really in that scrap metal, even despite its label, is incredibly difficult. Imagine you're a baker and you've bought some flour that already has salt in it. The person that sold it to you says, I think it's got maybe 0.1%, maybe 10% though, of salt in the flour. And they don't really know how much salt there is. And the only way that you can find out how much salt there is to bake the bread and taste it. So the amount of salt in your flour is very unpredictable and very variable, and scrap metal is the same. It's organized by type, but knowing what's really in it is incredibly difficult. So what steel plants do is they take their scrap metal, and because each grade of steel has a different chemical composition, they choose different types of scrap to try to get as close to that chemical composition as possible. They mix different types together, and we call this a recipe. And then you take your recipe and you put it into your furnace. So why do we need to have recipes in the first place? So first of all, if I'm a steel plant, I need to know, maybe every month, what scrap to buy and how much scrap to buy. Second of all, on a more daily or weekly basis, I need to know what I'm putting in the furnace in terms of the batch of steel that I'm making. So the recipes are really important. But how do I know what makes a good recipe? Why would I choose recipe A and not recipe B? So first of all, it's the chemical composition, which, as we've said, is very difficult to know. So the scrap composition dictates the quality of the steel. And if your steel quality is not right, then you will lose your customers, and you'll also waste an incredible amount of time and energy. The second component is the cost of the scrap metal. It's incredibly surprising to me still, but 40 to 70% of a steel plant's costs are made up of scrap metal. So it has a huge influence on whether or not the business is successful. And third of all, it's the market availability, which is also very unpredictable and variable. And if you run out of scrap, no steel. So we have three components, all of which are incredibly unpredictable and incredibly variable. And we have to figure out how to make steel from them. So we call this process scrap chefing. You create the recipes and then you choose the optimal recipe. And we think this is the biggest problem to solve in electric steelmaking. And the reason we think it's so important is that when Tata made the decision a couple of weeks ago to idle the blast furnaces in Wales, the biggest criticism that is leveled at them, once you move away from the thousands of jobs lost, is that you cannot make all grades of steel in an electric arc furnace with scrap metal. But on paper, this isn't true. It's in practice, when you account for the unpredictability and the variability, that this becomes an issue. And so you have the complexity of your inputs, and then you have the complexity of the scrap chefing process. So For any single grade of steel, you have quadrillions of possible recipes. And that's not an exaggerated number, it's a factual number. You then have a lot of inputs, like your steelmaking plan and your inventory and all sorts of things like that. You have thousands of plant level constraints. And then you have to consider all of that information in order to decide which recipe optimizes the most for cost, quality, and availability. And so right now you'd think steel plants must be using some really complex software to figure this out. Unfortunately not. Most steel plants are using spreadsheets and high levels of expertise from 2 or 3 people within the plant. And so the optimization is as good as they can make it, but it is still not optimal. And so you have these 2 or 3 people passing the spreadsheet back and forth to create the recipes. And so the inability for a steel plant to be adaptable and flexible to say, hey, no problem, we can suddenly make that steel that has traditionally only been made in a blast furnace, just isn't possible. So we want to change the fact that electric steelmaking is currently thought of as fragile, limited, and expensive. And we think that AI and machine learning is one of the big pieces of that puzzle. So this is our mascot, Scrap Chef. And what Scrap Chef does is takes all of the historical data from any given steel plant, analyzes it, and then suddenly Scrap Chef can know an awful lot more about the chemical variation in the scrap over a large number of years than any human could possibly know. Can know a lot more about the pricing predictability and start to make inferences about things like the meltability and efficiency of using types of scrap. It can then consider those quadrillions of recipes. It can consider the constraints and all the inputs, and it can tell you which is the optimal recipe on this day, in this hour, to use to make the grade of steel that you need to make. And so that is what we are working on, so that we take electric steelmaking from something which is limited and difficult to something which becomes robust, optimized, and flexible. And the thing that tops that off is that if you're a plant, you also get a large number of plant level benefits. So we can help you to use cheaper types of scrap or different types of scrap, so you decrease your costs. We're seeing millions of dollars saved by our steel plants. We can also increase your resilience, so it's no longer those 2 people in the plant that know how to do this process. And then we also can increase the efficiency because the whole process is automated end to end. And so all of this is a huge benefit to the plant. And so what we believe Scrap Chef can do is enable any steel plant to use scrap metal and electric arc furnaces to make any grade of steel. And so therefore we end up in a situation where we align both the commercial and the environmental incentives. Thank you.